Hey, before we start, we'd also like to acknowledge the country that we're on. William and I are joining you live, albeit socially distanced and virtual, here from the Gadigal land of the Great Eora Nation. First Nations people of this continent have been sharing stories and making art here for tens of thousands of years, and together they constitute the oldest continuing human civilization this planet's ever seen. And we're grateful to Gadigal elders, past and present, as well as elders of the Turrbal and Yagara people, where QAGOMA is built, that we can have the opportunity to continue making art and sharing stories here on Aboriginal land. William, it's such a pleasure to join you. I'm going to give a preamble for anyone who might have, I don't know, stumbled onto the Zoom by mistake, may not be completely familiar with your work. I'm pretty sure everyone is, though. But as you heard before, the exhibition, the retrospective of William Young's work, Seeing and Being Seen, does close tomorrow in Brisbane at QAG. See it today, see it tomorrow, but you only have this opportunity to see William's remarkable work. William was born in 1943, Queensland-born, now Sydney-based, very much like my trajectory, actually. And his photographic work spans an incredible 5 decades, capturing everything from Chinese Australian history and his ancestry, and of course, the thriving and evolving LGBTIQA+ scene in Sydney and beyond, but especially of the Mardi Gras as well. I've written and I've spoken before about how William's work, because I was a fan before I was a friend of William's, made me feel seen and captured and visible for the first time, and gave me a greater understanding of my twin heritages of being both Chinese Australian, a history that actually spans over 200 years on this continent, and also being queer. So William, it's so great to join you. I just want to start by asking you, how are things for you in lockdown? You can't be at the exhibition, but you can join everyone here, albeit virtually.
Oh, well, usually I work at home, so it's not so different from my usual day, but I do miss not going out to have a meal or have a drink with people.
Yeah, that kind of vibrancy of Sydney is not quite there at the moment. So look, that's the present day, and that's where you're at, that's where I'm at now. But maybe for this conversation, we can go to the past to begin with. Let's go right back. Let's go back to when you're 6 years old and to this iconic photograph of you. And this is you, would have been in Far North Queensland, and you've got that writing over your chest. And I'm wondering, could you tell us what is written on this young William Young and what was going on in his life?
When I was about 6 years old, one of the kids at school called me Ching Chong Chinaman, born in a jar, christened in a teapot, ha, ha, ha. I had no idea what he was talking about, although I knew from his expression he was being horrible to me. So I went home to my mother and I said to her, "Mom, I'm not Chinese, am I?" And my mother looked at me very sternly and she said, "Yes, you are." Her tone was hard and it shocked me. And I knew in that moment that being Chinese was like a terrible curse, and I could not rely on my mother for help. Or my brother, who was 4 years older than me, very much more experienced in the world, he chimed in, "And you'd better get used to it."
William, that is now an iconic sequence that you have performed before of your childhood and this kind of shocking realization of your identity and who you actually are. And let's go deeper into that heritage, because you were born in 1943 into a family of Chinese immigrants in Far North Queensland. Your father's specifically Hakka, your mother speaks Cantonese, and your common language is English. So you grew up speaking English, but looking like this Chinese kid, I imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, in a sea of probably white faces in the community?
Yes,
Mm.
yes. No Aboriginal people and no other Chinese. Mainly, although there were a lot of immigrants, new Australians they were called, from Italians, Yugoslavs then, and they were working in the tobacco industry. And
Mm.
so it was a mixed population, but European mix.
Mm. You know, at the end of what you just said, when your brother tells you, and you better get used to it, what happens after that? What are the main feelings that you carry when your mum confirms you are Chinese and your brother tells you you better get used to it?
Well, it's denial is
Mm.
really what happened. I denied that I was Chinese for 24, 26 years, for a whole period where it was just not something that we talk about. Although I had relatives, but we never ever talked about being Chinese.
Mm.
And it wasn't until, well, often I would, if people brought this up, I'd often shut down the conversation. Um, like when I was in my 20s, and people would assume I was a Colombo plan
Oh,
student.
right.
And this was in Sydney where nobody knew me. And I'd say, yes, I'm a Colombo plan student, just to shut down the conversation. So I just didn't like talking about it.
So I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that sounds like a shame that you carry around there. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, and I'm growing up on the Sunshine Coast in the 80s and 90s. And during the rise of Pauline Hanson in the 90s, my friends would reassure me by saying things like, "But Ben, don't worry, we don't see you as Asian." And when I think back on that, I remember when I was growing up, when they told me, "We don't see you as Asian," I was relieved and I was kind of proud, which is a strange thing to think about, because why should being Asian, being Chinese specifically, be anything to be ashamed about? But I look back and I realize I must have been ashamed of it to an extent, if when they told me they didn't see me as Asian was framed as a good thing. Can you relate to that as well?
Yes, because you kind of only realize that you were ashamed after the fact,
Mm.
because it probably manifests as denial when you're actually going through it.
Mm.
You don't kind of go around thinking, oh, I'm ashamed. It's only later that you think I was ashamed.
You say you carry this sense of denial and shame for at least the first 20 years of your life. What happens in your 20s that changes how you think about yourself and your heritage?
30s. It
Mm.
was a bit in
30s.
my 30s. I became Taoist, which is like a Chinese philosophy, and that led me to um, em, to embrace my Chinese heritage. And I went, um, I researched my family story. I researched the Chinese in Australia, and I just, well, I've written it here.
Mm.
People call me born again Chinese. And that's not a bad description, because there was a certain amount of zealousness
Mm.
in this. But now I see it as a liberation from ethnic suppression. And I prefer to say I came out as a Chinese.
You know, it's so interesting when you talk about the zealousness that came with that early stage of embracing your Chinese heritage, because I think of, for instance, when we come out as gay, and we will talk about that soon as well, where you know, in that first period where you've had to suppress this part of your identity for so long, you were so almost aggressive and passionate about embracing it. Tell me
Absolutely.
more. Tell me more about the zealousness of
Yeah,
embracing your
I've
Chinese
been a
heritage.
zealot. Well, see, here I am. I'm wearing a scholar's costume, for example. I'm embracing my Chinese heritage. Although I might point out it's not really a scholar's costume.
Uh-huh.
The scholar's character in Chinese opera costume. So it's actually an opera costume of the scholar.
Oh, so you're like in Tao scholar drag, is that what you're saying?
Well, theatrical, let's say.
And
And yeah, and I did make a big deal of it, and I kind of had parties, and Linda Jackson would wear her Chinese opera costumes and to them, and that kind of thing. And
yeah.
yeah.
I remember when I started becoming much more comfortable and confident about being Chinese Australian, it was also helped along and fueled by the fact that suddenly I had a lot more Asian Australian and specifically Chinese Australian friends, you being one of them, actually, that I could look up to and embrace across in my own peer groups. How much of that was a factor in you embracing your Chinese heritage? The fact that you didn't grow up with many people outside of your family who were also Chinese. Were you also becoming more part of the Chinese Australian community?
I tried, but they, I didn't find them that welcoming of me.
Tell me more
Partly
about that.
because, but partly because I was gay,
Hmm.
uh, and I was, so there was a bit of resistance there. But if we just jump, yeah, so there really wasn't, it was, there really weren't that many people that I could say that I actually knew.
Hmm. Well, let's talk more about this because I think what we're tapping into now is that sense of outsiderness can kind of carry between the communities that we're a part of. So there is racism within the gay community, and there can be homophobia within the Chinese and more broader Asian Australian community as well. This is a really interesting and beautiful photograph that you took in 1995, Invisibility, number one. It's two Asian men. And can you read what's on the caption that's covering one of their faces?
Please don't put me in your exhibition. I still live at home. No one knows about me. Put Norman in. He likes things like that. He wants to be in it. I'm not ready yet.
Wow. I mean, you could argue that maybe that's a sentiment of the time, but I think that's still such a common sentiment even now in
Uh,
2021.
Certainly with a lot of Asians,
Hmm.
yes.
Hmm.
Asians especially who are living in Australia but whose families are back in Asia. That's probably a common sentiment.
Mm. You know, to even get this portrait, I mean, I think involves a level of trust. And I mean, we can talk about your process more in depth, but in that first instance of getting people to be photographed and where they feel comfortable enough to be in front of your lens is a big leap of faith. What are those early conversations like? Because this person especially has to trust you not to reveal their identity.
Um, oh, well, actually, I broke his trust, I must confess, because I was about to publish his face, and he said, "No, no, no, don't put it in." But it was like the night before the book was about to be sealed, to be what go to press virtually, and
Yeah.
I just didn't have a substitute photo, so I made this work in a hurry, which is slightly mean of me, but then it's like one of my best works, so it just occurred. Um,
And so you
but
mean it was this version of the photograph with the covered face and the caption that went in?
yes,
Yeah. Well, then, in a way, I mean, you did kind of still hold the promise. He's in it, but not quite, right?
yeah, not quite, uh, but yes, it's still a bit.
I mean, to what extent do you relate to that feeling that's being expressed by him? I mean, nowadays, obviously, you're open, confident, and celebrated for your queer and Chinese heritages. But how easy was it for you in your youth to be open about being gay?
Well, I suppose I came out in the period of gay liberation in the 70s. And it was like people were liberating themselves, and it was fun and flaunting themselves. That's what I call it, flaunting. And so I came out, and then suddenly I realized I couldn't go back into the closet. And then I started to realize that it was like a never-ending process. You have to keep coming out to people. And then there were stages when I thought I got a bit sick of that. But then I knew that I couldn't go back into the closet. And then it became easier to me once I went on television. And so I didn't have to come out to every relative in every town in Australia, because I could do it on television. And
the conversation had happened in prime time.
Yeah, that's right. And so they knew. Well, not that they brought it up. Very few of them actually bring it up in conversation, but they know.
I mean, this shot was taken in 1995. Please don't put me in your exhibition. Do you feel like attitudes and things have changed that much since 1995? Like we were saying before, this is still a common thing that you'll find, especially in migrant background communities. But do you feel like the dial has shifted significantly since you took this photograph?
A little, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
It's all gay Asian politics is always a bit behind, like the mainstream white gay politics, because I was part of Asian lesbian and gay pride in the 90s, and we went in the Mardi Gras in the 90s, and there was like 24 years after the first Mardi Gras, so that there was that time lag. And I think that it's still a trickier process for gay Asians, especially, as I said, if their families are back in Asia.
Let's take a look at that photo of you in the 1990s being active with Asian, lesbian, and gay pride. This is such a joyous photo where everyone's holding you like a bikini model from Baywatch or in a game show, perhaps. Lead us through the times. Who are we looking at, and what's happening here?
So actually, this was at one of my survey exhibitions at the State Library. So it was really quite a big deal, 1999. And so, but these are all people from the Asian lesbian and gay pride group. And they were thrilled for me, as you can see from the photo. And so I guess that the pride group, the subtext to all of that is gay Asians becoming visible. And so they felt that they had a visibility, the group, and that they were proud of me.
Let's talk about visibility, because it makes me think of the title of this major exhibition of your work, Seeing and Being Seen. And I even said in the introduction, and I say in the essay that is published as part of your book of the works that accompanies the exhibition, that it was through your work that it was one of the first times, perhaps the first time, that I really felt visible as a gay Chinese man in Australia, all those very specific overlaps in your identities and mine. And I wonder for you, because you're a couple of generations older than me, did you have other people that made you feel seen through their art and their work?
Can you repeat that question, please?
You know, I was thinking that you are that figure for so many people, myself included, that made us feel seen as Asian people, as queer people, for many of us both. What about for you? Did you have storytellers, artists, public figures that made you feel seen?
I look over to Black America for my things that I read about race. In
Mm,
fact, James Baldwin was that incident, you know, when I was 6 years old, he is the only person I've read who had like not a similar experience, but he talks about the 6-year-old child becoming aware of racial difference. And I've
mm,
never seen that anyone else say that. And there are gay filmmakers, Tongues Untied, Marlon Riggs. So I kind of, I quite like reading the gay Black Americans.
James Baldwin is such a touchstone for so many, obviously within the Black community in the United States, but so many minority communities everywhere. Let's look at the celebration of one particular minority community, the gay and lesbian Mardi Gras. You are known for capturing this pride celebration, which began as a protest, of course, between 1985 and 2019, where this latest photo is taken, but you're a constant presence there generally. How have you seen and captured, have you seen Mardi Gras change over the years?
Well, it started off as like a protest march, although some people dispute that. But let's just go with the popular story. It
Okay, okay.
was a protest march in 1978. But Peter Tully, who was a very good friend of mine, became the director of the Mardi Gras and the workshop in 1982. And that's when I really got involved with the Mardi Gras. And so I think that those 80s were the golden years of Mardi Gras because it was small and it was creative and it was like our own party.
Mm-hmm.
And I took this photograph of the two boys here in 1985, and I suppose that I didn't really identify with them in terms of gay Asians because I guess I was like a radical gay, and and I didn't feel I had much in common. But then let's jump to this photograph in 2019
Mm-hmm.
where we get these buffed up Asians, and I think that. But what do you think? I think that they're from overseas. I didn't know them, and
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't seen them around, and so there are a lot of people from Singapore, they could
Mm-hmm.
be, or Hong Kong, who come to the Mardi Gras because they're affluent and they can have a good weekend.
Mm.
So and they look terrific, and it's a kind of a different image of Asian.
What do you like about what Mardi Gras has evolved into, and what do you miss from the old days?
Oh, well, I suppose I miss that creativity and this camaraderie, which I've already spoken about, it being our own smaller party then.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew so many people. And but it's become the flagship of the movement, the Mardi Gras. And I think that when Mardi Gras went on television, it changed the whole public attitude because it got into people's living rooms. And so it just penetrated the population in a way it never had before. And people were talking about it, you know. And gradually, I think this is my theory of being visible, is that if you're visible, then people get used to you and
Mm.
you're not so strange.
Not so
And
scary.
yeah, not so scary because you're just a person. So
Mm.
I think that was like the big change in Mardi Gras. And now Mardi Gras is still quite vibrant. It's different. I have to let go of the golden age and go to the Mardi Gras now. And it's too big. There are just too many people in the Mardi Gras. I wrote somewhere that one year there were 6,000 people in the parade alone. And really having that many people in the parade doesn't necessarily make a good parade. parade. In fact, quite the opposite happens because it's just becomes too unwieldy. But there's a lot of young people. It's kind of mixed, and there's a lot of energy. And whenever I photograph the Mardi Gras now, I always come away feeling uplifted.
Yeah, it's a great
along with
energy.
the energy.
Yeah, a huge energy as well. It also sounds like you're of the perspective that maybe part of its mainstreamness and growth is also its success is also partly its liability as well.
Yes.
You know, the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras started as protest has become a celebration. I think it can be both things simultaneously now and has grown to such a great kind of scale, and a huge party, as you say. But of course, queer communities in Australia and abroad carry, of course, a history of trauma and grief. And of course, most significantly through the HIV/AIDS crisis through the late 70s, 80s, and into the 90s as well. This is a picture of Alan from your monologue Sadness in 1990. And when you start this sequence of photographs of Alan, you point out that you hadn't been in touch for several years with Alan. When you met back in the 1980s, you were briefly lovers, and now you were kind of reuniting in Ward 17 of St. Vincent's. Tell us about Alan and that reunion that you captured.
Well, I hadn't seen him for about 4 years. We'd lost contact when he went to Melbourne. And then I was walking down Ward 17 of St. Vincent's Hospital. That's the AIDS ward. And I looked in and I saw Alan and I recognized him immediately, although he had changed. He seemed like an old man. And I had an overwhelming desire to burst into tears. But I'm glad that I didn't, because later he told me that someone else had come in, sobbed and thrown themselves on the bed. And he didn't think that was a very good way to behave.
You know, the story of Alan is his own story and is the story you captured, but it's the story of so many men and some women of that generation who were affected by HIV/AIDS. And of course, there's so many stories now that are recapturing that history. It's a Sin was such a huge popular TV show in the last couple of years, telling that story from the UK perspective. But, you know, these younger generations that are coming through the ranks, through Mardi Gras, weren't there to experience, you know, the decimation of these young men in that period. What do you think that younger generations don't quite grasp or understand about this period of loss and sadness?
I was a little bit distracted by my answer machine there, sorry. But I think that what you're asking me was, the younger people really don't have any idea of history, and yeah, they have no idea what the AIDS era was like, what a dark chapter it was, and like COVID is bad, but it's for a gay person, it's not as bad as AIDS, and yeah, they just have no idea. And I almost feel, yeah, I'd kind of like to tell them. I'd kind of like to tell them about it.
Yeah, and you do tell us and you show us through your work, because this photograph of Alan is one of many that you took of him in telling his story. It's a part of a greater sequence of him in hospital, then getting better before getting worse and worse until he passes away. It's one thing to experience that sadness and loss of friends, former lovers, people of your generation. It's another thing to capture it on film and to photograph it. Looking back, what compelled you? Why was it so important for you to document this?
Well, I guess I document people, and I'd taken a lot of photographs of Alan, and Alan, it was actually part of our relationship. is that he liked my photographs and he liked being photographed. And when he got AIDS, his world fell away from him. People would reject him. There was all levels of rejection from people, but I kept photographing him, and I think in some way that he appreciated it, that because at least I wasn't rejecting him. And
did it ever get tough? Because the photos become tough. You know,
yes,
seeing Alan's decline becomes tough.
it,
For the viewer, does it become tough for you as the photographer?
yes, it becomes tough and tougher. And but fortunately, I had the cooperation of Alan and the people who were looking after him. So I mean, they'd help me with the photographs, and Alan didn't mind. Although once a relative of Alan's was kind of looking after him, and I kind of felt that I couldn't just freely take photographs when the relative was there.
I'm so interested in how you navigate that process, because there's something about your work that reminds me of Australian writer Helen Garner in a way. You know,
Oh,
she
I
always,
adore Helen Garner.
yeah, she always has her notebook with her. And some people have said it's almost an impulse. You know, you see Helen Garner anywhere in any environment, whether it's a courtroom or a funeral, and the notebook will come out. But at the same time, I imagine there are situations where it's uncomfortable to take a photo of a camera out, which is less discreet than a notebook. How do you navigate those situations in order to capture intimacy, but at the same time respect people's boundaries?
Well, I'm always pushing the boundaries, and a lot of people will say, "Don't take photographs," or at funerals. Funerals is the one thing that people say. AIDS funerals, people will come up to me and say, "Don't take any photos, please." And yeah, yeah, people will tell you, I think.
You say you push the boundaries. You describe yourself as a radical gay, William. So let's talk about one of your most recent shows at the Sydney Opera House was Party. And this is a story of many radical gays pushing the boundaries and celebrating in joy. And I think one of the main threads of this is that parties continued throughout HIV/AIDS, almost as an act of defiance and to make sure that the community was being preserved and being held. So it's the story of Sydney's queer underground dance party spanning the 1970s when you first arrive in Sydney through to the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s to the present day. Tell me about Party, how it came about and how you stitched it together.
Well, yes, I photographed parties from the 70s, but around about the 80s was really one of the beginnings of parties, and they did start off as gay events. Like they didn't start till midnight, and I think that was because that's when the drugs kicked in, and then people were wanting to do something, and there was a phenomena called rat parties.
What was a rat party?
Recreational Arts Team was the name of it, but they had dance parties in the late 80s and the early 90s. And so, and I photographed the rat parties for Jack Vidgen. He paid me a paltry amount, but he still paid me to photograph the parties. But the party actually gave me a chance to actually look at the scene. And it was incredible in the late 80s. There'd be a dance party every week, sometimes two, and sometimes on the weekend, the long weekends, there'd be 5 dance parties in Sydney. It's just unbelievable that people would go. But when I did Party Verb, I realized that really this was the time of AIDS.
Yeah.
And I do think that AIDS was the motivator for the dance party. It was a kind of escapism because the reality was so grim, really, with people dying. And so that's what I attribute that incredible 5-year period of the dance party to the AIDS era, because it just fell off. They don't have dance parties
Yeah.
every week now.
And that's so interesting. It sounds like you didn't really quite connect the dots until you made Party Verb. Is that right?
It's true. It's true. Yes, I didn't. You know, I thought it was a craze. I just thought it was a fashionable craze at the time, and I was aware that it was a craze, but I didn't really think about the reason for it.
To what extent are you a participant in the parties, and to what extent are you the fly on the wall voyeur who gets a free pass at not participating because you have a camera in your hand?
Well, I'm more of the voyeur. I never dance. And another thing is people go to dance parties to listen to the music, dance to the music. And I never ever even listened to the music. And people say to me, oh, wasn't that a great set that Stephen played at 2 o'clock? And, you know, I wasn't even listening. I'm only honed into the visual at a dance party.
Okay, William, you know, shortly after you and I met and became friends, I remembered you had seen a photograph of me on Facebook, I think, where I was at a farewell party for my friend Mika, who's a Greek Australian man. So he's extremely hairy and I'm extremely not. And we all had to go there dressed as Mika. So I got a permanent mark. I put it all over my face, put it all over my chest. You saw this photo and you said, can you recreate that for me and also do it shirtless so I could photograph you? And I said yes. And that's become this kind of thing where you do photograph me. And one of the photographs of me is actually in the exhibition. We can take a photo of that. We can take a look at that. I'm a bit bashful about it, but I love that it's in the exhibition. Let's talk about this. Why did you ask me? And also, why did I say yes? This is these are questions I have for myself. And I guess it comes back to that question of like trust, right? How you get people comfortable enough to be in front of the lens.
Yes, I looked for the photo of you with with the Technicolor hair, which is called Hair Envy. But I couldn't find it, but I put this one in. Well, Ben, you're an attractive person, and so
Oh,
I'm
thank you, William.
happy to photograph you in whatever state of undress you feel comfortable with. And so, yeah, I'm happy to take a photograph. Uh,
What are
about
your
We're probably about due to have another one taken, I think.
There, that's true. Maybe it'll be our first post lockdown activity. It's
Yeah.
so funny that we're showing this because my mother is one of the participants in this Zoom event right now. I know she's definitely watching this, which is a good segue to the next image, which is of both of our mothers actually. And I'm really, really touched that you've included my mother as a part of this kind of juxtaposition with you performing and telling people about your mother in front of a photograph of your mother. The caption's quite small, but I know part of it is since my mother died, I've put the family into my written works and performance pieces. I didn't know if my mother would have liked it or not, and the relatives are divided in their opinion. Now, tell me, I'm really curious because I remember when I first became exposed to your work, it was at the Queensland Art Gallery at QAG. And my mother and I were both so drawn to photographs of your mother and the captions you wrote beside her. What Tell us about your mother, her life, and how you wanted to tell her story through your work.
Well, my mother was a big influence on me. My mother really taught me everything that I know. And she probably she probably was a private person in the sense that all people of her generation are less open about a lot of things.
Mm.
But before she died, I said to her, Mum, at Dad's funeral, nobody from the family talked about him. It was up to the priest to say something, and he gave the most generalized, offensive description of my father that I could ever think of. And I said to her, Mum, when you die, I want to talk at your funeral.
Mm.
And she said to me, yes, you can talk about me. Why would I care? I'd be dead, you know?
So do you feel like that was kind of tacit permission to be
Well,
able to tell her story?
yeah, that's right.
Mm.
Although during it, she wasn't so happy with me telling the story because she thought that I told too much. And some relatives don't quite agree with my telling of the story. And I think that they probably wouldn't, of their own volition, tell the story of humble beginnings. I think that's how I read it. That's what the ones who've done well don't like the humble beginning story.
Right. But you're never going to please everyone in a family,
Exactly.
are you?
You would realize this as a writer. Yes, you might as well just please yourself. But by and large, people do like the fact that I've told the story.
You know, it reminds me of when my mother and I were traveling through China and Hong Kong and Australia to record an ABC documentary, Waltzing the Dragon, about our personal history, but also about the broader Chinese Australian story. And I know that I've never said this publicly, I don't think, but when we were in Hong Kong, our relatives were there, but we didn't really actively seek their permission to tell parts of our family story. And Mum and I both agreed that as much as it was their story, it was also our story to tell. You know, we are members of this family and we have a specific interpretation of how events folded out. Do you feel similarly? Is that the motivation for you telling family stories?
Yeah, I think so, yes. Well, I've got that very good story about my murdered uncle. And that happened 80 years ago or 90 years ago. So it's kind of, I feel I can tell that story.
But also when you see the exhibition as well, and in your previous works, you capture the extended family tree of your family, but also of other Chinese Australian families as well, the faces of relatives and it's almost like capturing the face of Australia. Like part of me feels like when I see your work, you're telling the story of your family, but you're also telling a much bigger story about the Chinese in Australia. Is that something you're conscious of?
Oh yes, kind of, yeah. I think that Isaac Bashevis Singer said if you tell the story that you know well, no, you can't tell a generalized story about a generalized person because that will appeal to no one. But if you actually tell one story with its own depth and meaning, then it will become universal. So I've always worked on that principle. So I just tell my story in the hope that it will have a kind of universal application.
It is the paradox of storytelling, isn't it? That the more specific, the more nuanced you get, the more universally it seems to resonate. Let's go to this next image of the blocked moon gate. And are you able to read this caption out? Otherwise, I can read it for you.
Because I can't speak the language, there's only a certain penetration I can make into China. And even my best experiences tend to reinforce the fact that I am Australian.
Now, I imagine this is something that resonates with so many Australians, obviously of Chinese, of broader Asian, or of any migrant background, that we don't speak the mother tongue. So I don't speak Cantonese. I imagine this is something that resonates with people like Tony Ayres and Kylie Kwong and Annette Shun War. Tell me about what happens when you go back to China? What's going on in your head and your heart?
I love China. I love being there. But I always need an interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
So so there's only a certain penetration, but there's a deeper meaning to that second part of the thing, that I think that because I've been programmed in a Western Australian way, that's my default position, and I see everything in China as an Australian. So I can in the height of my claiming my Chinese heritage, I thought I could be Chinese, but there's no way I could think like a Chinese. It's a total foreign country to me, and so I just have to accept that I'm Australian, and I see it through Australian eyes always, because that's how I've been programmed.
Tell me if you feel the same way, but I think there's sometimes a pressure, especially on Asian Australians, that if we don't speak the language of our ancestors, that we're somehow less authentically Chinese, which I don't think is the same pressure that descendants of German Australians or Italian Australians get as much. Did you ever feel that pressure, and do you still feel that pressure now?
Not in Australia. I think the Australians like the fact that I speak English.
Yes.
But in Hong Kong, that's the place. That's the place where you're letting down the team, and you get a terrible hard time if you can't speak Chinese in Hong Kong.
Yes. I think the funniest experience I've had was when I was in a Chinese city. I think it might have been Beijing, with Linda Javen. Now, for those of you who don't know, Linda Javen's a great writer, scholar, and interpreter, but she's a redhead, now bluehead, Jewish woman from Connecticut. So she's white. And when we were in Beijing together, she would speak fluent Mandarin, and people would be so confused that I couldn't speak any of the language, but she could. So we are people who tend to discombobulate others when we're in China and Hong Kong, aren't we, William?
Yes.
Now, I mentioned Annette Chunwar as someone who could probably relate to what we're talking about, and she's in this next photo that was taken very recently, actually, in happier times when it comes to Sydney. Tell me about this event and this photo and why you wanted to include it in this conversation today.
Well, this was at an event. It was a gay literary event put on by the Bookshop and ACON and City of Sydney, actually. But I really wanted to get the three of us in. This was the only photograph I had of the three of us together. And really why I wanted to put it in is because we're all part of an organisation called Contemporary Asian Performance. No,
Contemporary Asian Australian Performance. That's right.
Of which Annette is the president, and or the CEO, and that's kind of like I feel a lot of support for this group, and it's like we're flying a flag to promote and Asian Australian performers and performance. And we lobby to get more content on TV, and we also have programs, writing programs, and we've lobbied major theatre companies to take on directors, young directors. And so I kind of feel very comfortable with this group. I feel that I'm using my experience to kind of contribute to an organisation and promote Asian visibility.
And you don't just contribute, you lead as well, William. I'm mindful of the fact that CAAP, so that's CAAP, Contemporary Asian Australian Performance. If you want to find out more, you can also donate. It is a not-for-profit organisation. That CAAP is also responsible for unearthing so many new voices. A lot of the stage plays that have been performed between Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne over the past 5 to 10 years, there's been such a huge groundswell of Asian Australian voices and performers. And so much of that is because of CAAP's work. A lot of those performances involve photographs, slideshow, and monologue, which is the form that you really pioneered and popularized in Australian stages. When you see those works that you've inspired and in some cases mentored or participated in, what goes through your head and heart, kind of seeing other people take on the form and cadence that you popularized and pioneered?
Well, it's really just storytelling, which is as old as the hills. But no, I feel really proud when I see. I don't have the copyright on storytelling, but I do see my influence. In shows like Double Delicious, which you were in, for example. Yes. And it's very much a storytelling format, 6 storytellers with food. And so that was, yeah, I was really thrilled with that production, for example. And
now, William, we don't have that much time and we are going to wrap up soon, but the final image is of you and me, not the final image of the gallery, of the exhibition has so many more images, but we're going to end on this. And I love the fact that you've included this photo. This is from a recent Yum Cha we had just before the current lockdown, when we still could have Yum Cha together in Sydney. And when I see this, I think of my personal pride in knowing you, my personal pride in being in your orbit, my personal pride that we are friends, feeling like that spiritual cord between us and generations has come full circle. I mean, as I write in the essay in the book, we even both have boyfriends named Scott, hilariously. That's how close we are. That's how close we overlap. But of course, seeing this photo makes me think COVID is in the community, which means that we're in lockdown, which means that you sadly can't be there for the last weekend of your exhibition at QAGOMA. You were there for the opening, happily, which is great, but not there for the closing. Is there any sadness in not being able to see the exhibition close tomorrow?
I'm terribly disappointed that I can't be up there, especially since Henry van Noordenburg had promised to have a party for me.
I'm sad about missing out on that party as well.
But anyway, look, let's put it this way. I'm just still thanking my lucky stars that we had the opening and the first performance of that weekend, because there was a lockdown on the Monday. And so we just scraped in by the skin of our teeth with that opening, which was great. And so I can't say that I'm unlucky.
Yes, because after that opening, COVID was chasing us, remember? Because then Annette Chunwar was there. She had to fly to, I think, Melbourne or Adelaide. I had to go to Melbourne and Adelaide. So COVID was chasing me around. So the fact that it happened at all and we were all there is quite remarkable. For the people in Brisbane who are still able to go to seeing and being seen today or tomorrow, and they see this great span of work that you've put out there, what do you want them leaving the exhibition feeling and thinking?
Well, I think that my work is really based on performance a bit. And I always allude to the 2 masks of theatre, the happy smiling mask and the tears. And so I always would like it for people to shed a few tears at my work and also to laugh. They're the two things that I'm aiming at.
Which is what life's all about when you think about it. Joy and grief, and holding both of those things at the same time. And you definitely capture that in your work. William, I'm so sorry we didn't get to talk in person with everyone at the Queensland Art Gallery today, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity that we got to share this virtual space with you today.